Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm your host Muriel, and in today's video I'm going to go over all of the books I read in the second quarter of 2025. So all of the 10 books I read in the months of April, May, and June. Starting with the one single item of non-fiction, I read Plenty, written by Frances Spufford, a book I was recommended by my partner, which I unfortunately didn't much enjoy. Now, its basic stated premise, that of illustrating the lives of Soviet citizens and their opinions regarding the Soviet dream of Red Plenty between the 1950s and 1970s, was certainly interesting, and I can't say I didn't learn anything worthwhile reading this book, because I absolutely did. But the format the author employed to develop this premise was poorly utilized and did not gel well with my brain. The aforementioned format being that of a hybrid between more or less neutral in tone, didactic, historical non-fiction, and narrative fiction made up of character vignettes. A kind of creative novelized non-fiction, if you will, that unfortunately, once again, ultimately failed to draw on the strength of either format. My biggest gripe with the book thus centers on its form, and more specifically the fiction part of its equation, because I don't actually think it really added anything all that interesting or compelling to the material. Since the author took pains to straightforwardly explain the history and theory at the heart of it in the book's various part introductions, its ensuing character vignettes often felt tediously redundant in the ways they then, on the whole rather clunkily, illustrated said history or theory. Redundant or outright boring. I had to speed, then skim read in places. It was that painfully boring. And this in itself is largely because of the character work, if you can call it that, was on the whole pretty bad. The vast majority of the book's characters talked or thought to themselves about the book's subject matter in a way that didn't feel real. They felt like mouthpieces instead of people, essentially. And the varying characteristics felt largely wasted in terms of thematic potential and scope, especially where the too few female characters were concerned. I'll come back to this in a second. I guess the idea here was to make the reader care more directly about the subject matter through the presence of relatable characters, but I'm not a character-driven reader in any case, and to me, those vignettes more often than not felt like an annoying distraction from the actual history and socio-economic theory. I just did not care about those characters, and I didn't need to remain interested in the actual topic of the book. The prose, for its part, felt painfully overbearing at times, what with the paragraph-long sentences and, again, pointless, rambling descriptions that bogged the text down in so many places. But then, I can't say I didn't have any issue with the substance of this book either. Most of that was fine, yes, but I couldn't help but feel a little cheated by the book's advertised premise. I expected a much more comprehensive illustration of the socio-political Soviet dream, as experienced and reflected upon by some of the people who experienced it firsthand. But really, the book mostly focuses on the aspirations and failures of centralized Soviet economic planning specifically, and its mediation through linear programming, and ultimately AI? No, seriously, it almost felt to me at times like this book was, in fact, ultimately about the hopeful promises of socialist AI. Which again is fine, but it also left me a little disappointed since the book also dabbled a little in illustrating things like intellectual censure or Soviet anti-Semitism, but then said absolutely nothing about the condition of women or the broken dreams of Soviet feminists, when a couple of the book's female voice vignettes absolutely could have done this. And I wish it had, because I am a little sick and tired of male-penned books that claim to represent an era, a political regime as a whole, the ideas of a people pretending like the specific misogyny-informed condition of its female half just doesn't exist or matter. It's even more frustrating, not to say infuriating, when male authors do include female points of view, but only to have them miserably fail the Bechdel test and go through gratuitous and, frankly, misery-porn levels of sex-specific degradation to illustrate just how badly the commies failed at OBGYN care. Yes, this book, of all freaking things, features an unnecessarily, and I maintain gratuitously, harrowing experience of childbirth from the point of view of a character who is also beaten and verbally abused by her husband. 'Cause why not? Or to make a point about something called psychoprophylaxis, because something dumb Soviet idealism, apparently, and not more fundamentally, you know, fucking transnational and trans-ideological medical misogyny, androcentrism in medicine, etc. Like, bruv couldn't take 2 freaking seconds to drop a word about the very relevant topic of feminism in relation to communism, but could write this. Yeah, full disclosure, I nearly threw my Kindle across the room when I read that and nearly DNF'd the book right then and there. I was so utterly disgusted. So part of me wants to say this book was not worth reading even once, given the rage I felt going through that particular chapter, but I did learn interesting tidbits about Marxist economics, Soviet communism, and, well, yeah, linear programming of all things, and that certainly wasn't worthless. Still, I'm not sure I can really recommend this one, though I want to be clear that that's chiefly because of the book's clunky, creative non-fiction format. That really just did not work for me. Seems to me it would just be better to read actual non-fiction about this topic, or properly good historical fiction set during this time period. Moving on to the fiction now. I read a book called Life, a sort of science fiction novel written by Gwyneth Jones that I decided to read because I'd heard it was a work of feminist science fiction, and because, little bonus for me, it is part of the Science Fiction Masterworks collection. And it is about an English female geneticist named Anna Sanoz, who discovers the TY viroid, a viroid that transfers the SRY gene from the Y chromosome to an X chromosome, and basically her life experiences as a female scientist, a wife, a mother, I guess somewhat repressed bisexual woman, and, well, and at the very least, autistic-coded woman. The story follows her at university, where she meets her future husband, an American exchange student named Spencer, who is clearly more in love with her than she is, outwardly at least, and where she also meets a wild card of a woman named Ramon, who becomes her best friend, kind of, and, well, repressed lesbian love interest is how I'm going to put it. Ramon studies a bunch of things at uni, presents herself as a radical lesbian feminist, but then she also fucks guys, then drops the feminist label and loudly proclaims all feminists are abject morons, then picks the feminist mantle back up, and then she writes and publishes books, and then she's also into super degrading BDSM. The woman had major psych issues, was a massive asshole, and I found her a really hateful character. Anna is also raped at uni by a fellow student and colleague, and this impacts her academic trajectory and her career, and then she just kind of keeps getting into hot water with regards to her discovery of this TY viroid, which might threaten humanity's understanding of sex and gender. Not really. And you follow the highs and lows of her marital relationship, how she deals with a miscarriage, then motherhood, etc., etc., and you may have noticed my less than enthusiastic tone of voice here. Well, that's because of a few reasons, one of which being the fact that this has absolutely no goddamn business being an SF masterworks. Life is not proper science fiction, not in my book at least. At most, it's a bad wannabe. I say wannabe because I actually mostly like them. Sally Rooney slice of life relationship drama with a sprinkle of speculative scientific inquiry. Said inquiry revolving around, well, the potential disappearance of the Y chromosome through viroidal transfer. Whoopee freaking do. Now yes, the Y chromosome is actually shrinking in the real world, I mean in real life. But it probably won't disappear entirely, and even if it does, the SRY gene will just migrate somewhere else. And I believe this has in fact already happened in an animal species, a mammalian species. That, or our species, will develop another mechanism for differentiated sexual development, also, you know, in millions of years. And like, yeah, the XY system, our chromosomal system, it's not the only one out there. There's the ZW system in birds, there's, you know, temperature-determined sexual differentiation in some species of reptiles, etc. So even if life's premise were real, it wouldn't redefine sex for human beings in the slightest. And as to gender, well, that's a distinct matter in any case. Besides, this whole shtick with the TY viroid makes up, what, 1% of the actual plot of this book? The rest was made up of insanely tedious drama, centered on largely tedious to hateful characters, only marginally interested in actually dissecting gender and female sex-based oppression. Because no, this isn't even really feminist fiction either, or barely. Sex and gender are, well, conflated out the wazoo by all parties concerned. One character, for instance, states that there will be multiple sexes in the future because TY is reconfiguring the sex chromosomes. No, wrong, fail, kill me now. Or another says, clearly the proof is there in the proverbial pudding because gender roles are loosening up because biology is being reconfigured. So, yay, gender essentialism for the win there. Again, kill me now. Female experiences are centered in this story, kinda, sure, but I mean, both Ramon and Anna seriously needed therapy for CPTSD. God damn. Not that having CPTSD automatically invalidates your feminist analysis, of course not. But here, there just wasn't anything interesting or particularly salient to speak of. These characters were just largely fucked in the head, especially Ramon, who was shown to be, again, into very degrading and violent sex, and what she termed self-harm as empowerment. Big yikes. Which to me sounds way more like post or faux feminist bullshit a la Camille Paglia. She's actually name-dropped in the book, or Virginie Despentes, so bleh. Now, Anna was also very clearly autistic-coded, and I'll admit, her experiences as a broadly neurodivergent female scientist in a male-dominated field, and well, I don't know that it's a neurotypical dominated field, but male-dominated field was, yes, a valuable part of the book. But then, you know, it was the only truly valuable part of the book. But then even that was muddled by asinine conflations with gender, because so Anna goes into this whole thing where she thinks to herself, maybe I'm a female scientist because the TY viroid's mixing up the sex chromosomes, and so that's why I'm like a dude with Asperger's syndrome. What? Really, bro? Yeah, I guess I was going for the rather repugnant extreme male brain theory of autism, so hashtag this is aged very poorly indeed. Damn. And then there was Spencer, who started out being kind of a good person, happy to be a supportive stay-at-home husband, then father, until, psych, actually no, my masculine ego hurts, wah, and I need to smash my pretty younger colleague who happens to be married to the man who raped my wife back when she was a much younger doctoral student at uni. Not that he knew about that last bit, to be fair, but still, he basically just ended up being yet another asshole. It's not like Anna was a perfect character either, by any means, because, I mean, she kind of neglected her marriage throughout the story to a certain extent, but then you fucking talk about it, know what I mean? It was just so tedious. On top of all of that, the book was also kind of triggering for me in places, though that wasn't its, fault. It's obviously a very personal thing. Still, overall, as you can probably tell, I hated this book. Definitely one of the worst things I've read this year so far. It was a giant, vacuous, and frustrating nothing burger plot and theming-wise, filled with, again, tedious and hateful characters, I wish I could have DNF'd. But since I had a physical copy of it, well, I felt compelled to finish it. You win some, you lose some, as they say. After that unpalatable mess, things didn't get much better, because I read Dragonfall, written by L.R. Lamb, a book I purchased at Worldcon last year, more or less because its author was on a dragon-dedicated panel I attended. The panel was really good, as an FYI, but unfortunately, the book was also absolutely not worth my time or money. So, the premise of Dragonfall: you have a secondary fantasy world where dragons used to, well, rule the world, but then humans decided to yeet the lot of them into a, what I'll call, parallel pocket dimension of sorts, where they are now slowly dying because the environment is going to shit or something like that. And you're not really given a reason as to why this happened, but that's the sitch. The story is principally set back in what I'll call the main universe, and then more specifically in the nation or city-state of Locke, where humans worship dragon gods and keep little wyverns as pets and messengers, and everyone, if I got that right, is born with a type of magic affiliated with one of the 5 dragon gods. Though I guess some people are better magic users than others, but I guess everyone has the potential to use magic. That was actually a problem for me in terms of world building and stakes establishment, but anyway, moving on. On top of that, dragons in this story are basically like the dragon in Reign of Fire, if you're familiar with that movie. It's an almost all-female species with just 1 or 2 males born each generation, and then if those males practice prophetic magic specifically, they go big nuts. Kind of like, you know, magic wielding by men in the Wheel of Time series, I guess. And so that tidbit ties back into the plot. Speaking of which, so it kicks off when the dragons decide to send their sole remaining male member through a portal back to the main universe to try and save their species. He's supposed to, like, bring them all back to the main universe, basically. He then becomes entangled with a female non-binary character who is trying to avenge her family, or rather, clear her family name, because her granddad might have caused a plague that fucked things up majorly in Locke. Something like that. And she's also a skilled thief and grew up among thieves, yada yada, and so she eventually teams up with the dragon, and yeah, there's a romance plot in this as well. Right, so for starters, the prose in this book didn't really work for me. Something about it just felt, I don't know, clunky, like it unsuccessfully tried to merge an old-timey, ye-old fantasy style with a more contemporary one, I guess, and it just didn't work. The world building wasn't entirely bad. The magic was a bit different, I suppose. Not that it made a ton of sense either, like I hinted just a second ago. But then the, in my book, woke genderist stuff, because there are like 5 genders and Lokian society, something like that. That was, and I cannot stress this enough with regards to this particular story, idiotic as fuck. Oh my god. Immersion nuking and cringe, because in what universe does it make sense for a non-human animal, here a dragon, that comes from a primarily female and also parthenogenetic species to feel the burden of masculinity? Yes, at one point the book's 2 main characters discuss gender, which was already a bit like, yike, and the dragon states he struggles with masculinity. But I'm like, what the fuck would masculinity even mean in that context? Again, for a non-human animal. But then it's not like it made a ton of sense on the human side of things either. The nation of Locke wasn't shown to be particularly patriarchal or misogynistic or sexist at all, yet its culture had, like I said, multiple genders, and what the human MC exposition dumped about gender expression, again, that was just like, what the fuck is happening? It felt like it was lifted straight out of some cringy postmodern philosophy or queer theory textbook. Outside of my own feelings about this stuff, come on, it just didn't feel organically woven into the story or its world at all. It felt so freaking out of place. Immersion nuking, yeah. Like, put some effort into it at least. Make it make sense. Was in my book, though, there wasn't that much draconic world building either. You're told dragons are an almost all-female species and that temperature determines sex in it. as it does in Turtles, for instance, and like I just said a few seconds ago. And then nothing! So, yeah, talk about wasted potential for something neat, or at the very least, engagingly different there. Also, the story's dragon character bopped about in human or quasi-human form for most of the novel. Yeah, dragons here are all were-dragons by default, apparently, so it's not like genuine dragons actually take up that much page time in this book in any case. Big sad! And then yes, there's a cringy as fuck romance in this bitch too. Okay, it's not the worst I've ever seen, but it was still fucking stupid because, again, in what universe does it make sense for a dragon who, by the way, hates human beings on a species-wide level? Because remember, humans are the ones who expel dragons from the main universe, so in what universe, this one apparently, does it make sense for a dragon like that to feel sexually attracted to a human being, a Homo sapiens, our human MC? I could buy it from What's Her Face. You think I remembered her name? Absolutely not. Because she interacted with What's His Face. You think I remember his name? Absolutely not. In human form. And so, you know, she didn't know any better. But coming from the actual reptilian, very much so, with some feathers as well, points for floof, hexapod dragon, just no! Fuck off with that nonsense! And also, may I add, ew, gross. Finally, the lot of it felt a little YA-ish at times too, though not to an egregious degree or that bothersome of a degree, I guess. So fine, minor quibble. The plot itself as a whole was also fine. But still, taken all together, this was insanely mediocre, and again, a waste of time and money. Oh, and I should add, this is also the first book in a series, but I will obviously not be checking out its sequels. After that, things did actually start to get a little better, because I read When Among Crows, a novella written by Veronica Roth that features various kinds of supernatural beings inspired by real-world folklore, such as banshees or vampires, except here they bop about in present-day Chicago and basically feed on different human emotions. And then there's a group of people that hunt these supernatural creatures called the Knights of the Holy Order. Not the most original name, but fine. And they're kind of metal, actually, because they carry swords in their spines. And yes, it very much does hurt when they unsheath them. So cards on the table, I chiefly picked When Among Crows up because of its title, though that's mostly false advertising because crows aren't really prominent in the story at all. I'm being cheeky here, the title actually references a Slavic proverb, so, you know, fair enough. And then because once upon a time, I read the Divergent trilogy, also written by Veronica Roth, and so when I saw this novella, I was like, oh hey, it's by the same author, wonder what her adult fiction is like. And, well, it was actually a decently pleasant little novella. It plays around with Slavic folklore and mythology, the Polish section thereof more specifically, in a way I found, well, just about satisfyingly refreshing and engaging. And, you know, considering this was a novella. It also featured a pretty interesting magic system, or the sketch of one at any rate, based on debt and self-sacrifice, and then radically masochistic monster hunters. Now, I'm not gonna lie, yes, the Knights of the Holy Order very strongly reminded me of the Mortal Instruments Shadow Hunters, which obviously wasn't helped by the novella's urban fantasy quality. Not that that's a bad thing necessarily, mind you. It just felt very obvious to me. The story was fast to very fast paced, and there was nice symmetry where the opening and ending of it were concerned. The prose, for its part, was fine to good. The character work, it unfortunately was very weak, insofar as it principally rested on the emerging relational synergy between the story's three protagonists. These went from being complete strangers, or acquaintances at most, to being intimately bonded, all in the span of, what, a couple of days, if I got that right? Which obviously felt incredibly forced to me, if not a little juvenile. So yes, whilst I think this just about counts as adult fiction, I couldn't help but be reminded of Veronica Roth's previously read trilogy, or, like I already said, something like The Mortal Instruments, both of which are very firmly YA fiction, Make of that what you will. The few hours I spent reading this novella were, yes, more pleasant than not, but I don't think it was quite good enough for me to check out its sequels. I mean, I'm assuming there are going to be several of them in the future, unless, I don't know, I get confirmation that the further development of the story's Slavic folklore and mythology-inspired world-building specifically really, and I mean really, makes it worthwhile. After that, I read Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries, written by Heather Fawcett, a fantasy story about Emily Wilde, a dryadologist set in the 1920s in an alternative version of our world where fairies and fairy-like creatures, collectively called the folk, are real. It's basically a natural history of dragons, but with fairies. Emily goes on an expedition to the far north of Europe to study the local fairies, is quickly joined by her colleague and best friend, Wendell Bumblebee, and stuff happens with the locals and the local folk. I have to say, this was refreshingly pleasant. Like, I don't have a ton to say about this little cozy-ish fantasy story, but it went down rather smoothly, and that was really nice. Most of all, I enjoyed its central fairy motif, and the important stories and folklore were given in folk culture and arguably magic. It also helps that the book's MC was very clearly autistic coded, though conversely, I find those types of characters often lack the sensory sensitivities that are common for many of us indie folks, and I'd like to see that corrected in the future, honestly. I kinda liked her male counterpart too, an Irish gentleman, though. Why did he have such an over-the-top English name? I mean, come on, Wendell Bumblebee. Especially given the time period would have broadly coincided with Ireland's Gaelic revival, but maybe I'm asking too much there. Still, I didn't want to, hurl at the sight of their largely friend-based romance. Yes, there's a romance. So point. The folk themselves were appreciably magical and menacing, so that was all good. That being said, given this story's overall lack of depth in terms of theming and world-building, it could most definitely have been a tad shorter. Still, in terms of faux naturalist academia cozy fantasy, bit of a mouthful, this was actually better than A Natural History of Dragons for me, which I'm a little sad to say. After that, I read A Door into Ocean, written by Joan Slonczewski, a utopian novel that features an all-female society of genetically modified human beings living on an ocean moon named Shora, and interrelated world-building and theming on anarchism, non-violence as a way of life, and ecological balance. This is something I picked up because I came across the title during one of my searches for female-centric science fiction, and which I went into with low expectations, because I've been disappointed in the past, but which I thoroughly enjoyed. It was a very pleasant surprise. So much so, in fact, that I recorded a dedicated review of it for the channel, and which I thus cordially invite you to check out if you're interested. If, however, you simply want the Cliff Notes version, as it were, well, I found the book's prose was fluid overall, with very vivid and evocative but ultimately balanced descriptive writing, something which was obviously necessary to bring the oceanic world of Shora to life in the text. Well, the world and its many creatures and its people. I enjoyed the fact this was a multi-point of view story, as this allowed for a diverse array of thematically relevant perspectives with regards to the sharers' way of life, the sharers being the human inhabitants of this ocean moon called Shora. And the character work itself was actually quite good. All of the main point of view characters were given just enough background to flesh out layered and mostly nuanced personalities that felt real and thus believable. The only character who perhaps felt a little less nuanced was the story's main singular antagonist, or rather the representative of the story's antagonistic faction, but even then I don't think it was an actual problem for the narrative or the development of its themes. Speaking of which, most of all, I enjoyed the book's world-building and theming. As concerns the former, Shora's interconnected world and people were beautifully brought to life in terms of biology and ecology, and biotech to a slightly lesser extent, and kept my mind wonderfully engaged throughout. I also enjoyed the sharers' anthropological and linguistic world-building, I felt it was a little less satisfyingly fleshed out for my taste and level of curiosity when it came to their reproductive biology and history as a people and subspecies of humans specifically. Then there was beautifully thoughtful theming on radical pacifism, non-violent anarchism as a way of life, and ideological rigidity or purity and its costs in terms of survival when one can no longer sustain a completely isolated existence. All in all, A Door into Ocean was a very thoughtful, ideas-driven and compelling story with highly engaging socio-psychopolitical theming and quasi-utopian world-building without any soapboxing or preachiness. The best kind of ideas-driven SF. Yay. And if you enjoyed Women on the Edge of Time by Marge Piercy, The Dispossessed, and or Always Coming Home by Ursula K. Le Guin, I would most definitely consider picking this one up. Oh yes. After that, again, a very pleasant surprise, and in parallel to House of Leaves, which I'll come back to shortly, I read Sally Rooney's latest novel, Intermezzo, which follows two brothers in Dublin, of course, although I guess Beautiful World, Where Are You wasn't specifically set in Dublin, but here very much in Dublin, and now I can actually picture the places the characters go to, because I've been to Dublin several times now anyway. So it follows two brothers trying to deal with the recent loss of their father, semi-alternative, I know what I mean, old and new romantic relationships, and their complicated relationship with one another. I decided to read because, well, I broadly enjoyed all of Sally Rooney's previous novels. They also read very quickly for me, and I was curious to see how she would handle a story with exclusively male character points of view. And I thought it was good overall. Yay! Again, there was, for me, a noticeable maturation and refinement in theming, which I really appreciated, and which here heavily focused on grief, and then on life transitions, love, and, you know, the intersection of all those things. The character work was good, with good levels of nuance and interiority. Not that I necessarily liked said characters, but that's fine. I don't really like any of Sally Rooney's characters outside of normal people's Marianne. There was, once again, effective and affecting writing on love, desire, relationships, and sex, as I somewhat expected, to be honest. I liked the book's, shall we say, polyamorous or ethical non-monogamy representation, sort of. Just like there's sort of polyethical non-monogamy representation in Conversations with Friends. I want to stress that sort of. But here, I did not like the age gaps involved. Yeah, it just made me a little uncomfortable. That being said, I love the fact the story featured characters acting like mature, if damaged, but still mature adults, and talking things through and acknowledging wrongdoing, apologizing. Just, yes, thank you. More of that in stories that feature romantic relationships, please. And then I found Intermezzo's ending really satisfying, both from a narrative and emotional standpoint. So, yeah, I'm actually somewhat pleasantly surprised, again, by this one, because I guess I expected less of it. But I definitely preferred it to Beautiful World, Where Are You? So, again, yay for me. And so I also finally read House of Leaves, written by Mark Z. Danielewski. Yes, the infamous work of a gothic cosmic horror fiction about a liminally fucked, is how I'm going to put it, house and the media created about it. And I loved it! I loved it. I actually think it's probably a new soft favorite, and I recorded both a reading vlog and a thorough book review for this one, if you're interested. Again, though, if you'd simply rather have the cliff notes, this was definitely ideas-driven SFF, nom nom, and most definitely cosmic horror in the best way. I was reminded of Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow, though this, House of Leaves, was infinitely better. I also thought of found footage or analog horror while reading this book because it really felt like the literary equivalent of that. There was some truly great prose here. Tone setting and great synergy between the faux academia parts of the text and its eldritch, haunting, yes, haunting, not haunted, house story. The book's ergodic formatting and metadiegetic structuring felt really well utilized overall, and the aesthetic deployment of the echoes, plus labyrinth, plus minotaur motif in all of the story's layers was deliciously effective. There was absolutely heartbreaking, in a good way, mind you, character writing in the Whalestow letters. I love that section. It made me cry. Though conversely, there was a bit of unpleasant cringe with Johnny Truant's part of the narrative, with, to me, superfluous material that didn't really add anything to the greater story. Though, as a whole, the different parts of the story worked well together. Finally, there was certainly good theming in this book on trauma and family relationships, yes, but then great theming on Homo sapiens' never-ending quest for meaning and death of the author in relation to that, all realized through the subgenre medium of, here, wonderfully chills-eliciting, cosmic, and yes, liminal horror. Yum 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 yum, indeed. Also, as a friendly PSA, House of Leaves really isn't that bad in terms of reading difficulty. After that great success, I read The Bright Sword, which is basically Lev Grossman's take on the Arthurian mythos. In this retelling, the protagonist is a young aspiring knight from Scotland named Colin, and when he arrives at Camelot, in the beginning of the story, you learn most of the Knights of the Round Table and, well, King Arthur himself, obviously, if you know your mythos, have recently died at the Battle of Camlan. The remaining knights, the rejects of the Round Table, if you will, thus feel rather dejected and depressed about the situation, understandable, and don't really know what to do with themselves. Unfortunately, for better or worse, it is up to them to figure it all out and help steer Great Britain into the bright unknown of tomorrow. And so, that's the story of the book. Lev Grossman's The Magicians, which is right here, is one of my top 10 favorite works of fantasy. I love that book, and also thoroughly enjoyed The Magician King, hashtag Julia my beloved, and hashtag that was not okay though. If you know, you know. The Arthurian legend, for its part, is one of my favorite pieces of folklore and mythology, and then more broadly than that, Celtic mythology as a whole stands as my #1 favorite body of mythological lore and pagan symbolism. And yet, I didn't really like The Bright Sword. To start on a positive note though, I didn't entirely dislike the story's rather cheeky tone, nor all of its narrative reshuffling. I mean, every version of it written by, well, older or more contemporary writers will be different to a certain extent. That's kind of part and parcel of it. I also love this version of Morgan Le Fay. Best character by far, don't at me. She made excellent points regarding the Romans and Christianity. She was hashtag immeasurably based, and I was entirely on her side the whole way through. So it kind of sucks that she was the story's not quite antagonist, but certainly anti-hero, I guess, and that she didn't ever get a point of view chapter of her own. She was indeed good and properly shafted. Welp. And then outside of that, I can add that the book's epigraphs were pretty solid. Well done with that. Okay, now time to let her rip. Unfortunately, this book felt too much like a poorly executed The Magician's AU fanfic, and good gods, did that not work for me. The Camelot rejects felt like an inferior version of the physical kids from The Magicians, and the former's quest for God, crown, and country felt like an inferior version of the latter's search for meaning in life and struggles with difference, mental health, etc. I loved the portrayal of depression in The Magicians. I mean, it's one of its strongest themes, its focus on found family, and the beautiful messiness of its nerdy or even neurodivergent coded characters. Once again, hashtag Julia my beloved. The Bright Sword, by comparison, had none of that depth and emotional resonance. So much about it just felt incredibly superficial and vacuous. Its characters chiefly counted as rejects because of some paltry concern with identity, and their characterization largely stopped there. To wit, with multiple examples, Dinnerdan was big sad because she was a transsexual female. That's it. Bedivere was big mad because he was gay and couldn't make sweet lovin's to his bestie Arthur. That's it. Nimue was big mad because she was almost raped by Merlin. I mean, okay, hashtag valid. I got you. But like outside of that and her stupid love of God, there was nothing to her. Constantine had barely sketched out daddy issues. That's it. Palamedes was the one Arab guy on the crew. That's it. Scipio, a hashtag lawful neutral Roman centurion, got fucked and time-eated by a fairy queen, and that's it. Lancelot went big religious nutso because he wasn't loved enough as a kid, and that's all he is and ever will be. And as to Arthur and Colin, I'll concede they had a tad more substance, but not nearly enough for compelling character-driven storytelling. Which I'm already not about as is. or good theming. I'll just come out and say it. This thing went a little too hard on the wokiness. And the fact is, you need more than surface level representation to write a good story. It was all just so on the nose, so unsubtle, especially when you consider those character vignette chapters. They're like character origin stories, which also really fuck with the book's flow and pacing, I might add. And then also when you factor in the book's ending, which almost read like a Twitter tirade against Reform UK's racism and xenophobia. Like, okay, I'm against said racism and xenophobia, but like, can you tone it down a little? All I could think was, oh, will you please just shut the fuck up? We get it! The British Isles are made up of several different ethnic groups brought in by several different waves of migration. Not just, good old colonialism with, like, the Romans. But then it's not like anything truly meaningful was done with, oh, I don't know, the ideas of the passing of ages, mass-scale societal change, or religious conflict. Not like that's mandatory either, of course, but I'm an ideas-driven SFF reader, and I'm not ashamed of that. And when you come from the likes of the Myths of Avalon or even the Warlord Chronicles, it just doesn't measure up. No. I guess I would have preferred it had this book leaned more heavily into actual satire or dark humor. The fact it still seemed to take itself somewhat seriously really bugged me, because it really shouldn't have. Not with this disingenuous feeling checkbox-ticking approach to theming. Ugh. And then a very minor thing, the book mixes and mashes elements of the Arthurian canon in a way that doesn't pay any real heed to historical congruence or accuracy, and at times this hurt my brain a little. But to be fair, Mr. Grossman freely acknowledges this narrative choice in his afterwards, so fine. Yeah, fair enough. I'll in turn freely acknowledge this just doesn't really suit my own tastes and preferences. But so yeah, this was barely worth reading once, and it only really managed to get a 6 out of 10 out of me because of its very based version of Morgan Le Fay. And then, at the end of June, I finally read Absolution, book 4 in Jeff Vandermeer's The Southern Reach. Well, we can't say trilogy anymore, can we? Although, I'll probably keep doing it if I'm being honest. The Southern Reach is my favorite science fiction series of all time, and I was very apprehensive to read this 4th entry because I didn't want it to sour the perfect little gemness of the original trilogy. Jeff Vandermeer, as an FYI, is also one of my favorite authors. I mean, I have an entire shelving, cube space dedicated to Jeff Vandermeer and China Miéville's fiction. So, that should tell you everything you need to know. But I've had misses with him. Yes, I'm looking right at you, dead astronauts. And I've been burned too many times already by surprise series entries that are published years after the fact to, well, blindly trust the process, shall we say. And yes, I am thinking of Children of Memory with that specific sentence. Anyway. But as it so happens, for once, I really enjoyed Absolution. That being said, I'm also not entirely sure why it exists. It adds very little in terms of world building or, well, overt, extraneous narrative resolution, and it essentially adds nothing at all in terms of theming, unlike, say, something like The Testaments with The Handmaid's Tale, or The Book of Dust with his Dark Materials. Though maybe that's not the fairest comparison. Whatever. Still, I do want to stress that I had a lot of fun reading it. But yeah, why does it exist though? I think this feeling mostly stems from the fact Absolution isn't a sequel, which I guess that's what I thought going into it. It's a prequel, or rather, it's a collection of 3 prequel novellas that essentially tread the same ground in terms of vibes, tone, and narrative flavor. Just, weirdness, annihilation, authority, and acceptance do. Which, again, was fun. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It was a pleasure to be back in that story in Area X. Yes, even though it's horrific, but it's also beautiful. It's beautifully horrific and horrifically beautiful. Yay. And honestly, I'm really glad this book is a prequel that doesn't really add anything to the series deeper substance-wise, because that means it can exist in its own somewhat distinct narrative space and does not really impact my relationship to the Southern Reach trilogy at all. That way, well, I can have my cake and eat it too. Not that I ever recommend this to readers who haven't read The Southern Reach either, right? Like, don't pick this up if you haven't read The Southern Reach, it just wouldn't make sense. It's just that for me, this book, this collection of novellas, stands more as fun bonus material rather than an essential chapter in the story of The Southern Reach, if that makes sense. And honestly, I'm more than fine with that. Now I'll quickly go over a few noteworthy pieces of cinematic and video game media I enjoyed over the past 3 months. First, there's the first season of Freerun Beyond Journey's End, a slow-paced, high-fantasy anime that follows an elf mage named Freerun, her apprentice Fern, and other characters, and their adventures, to keep it short and simple. I watched this with my partner Christopher, and we both thoroughly enjoyed it. The art style is lovely, if not honestly gorgeous, when it comes to landscapes and plant life. Like, it was just really lovely to look at. The show's vibe, for its part, is pretty cozy. There's a relaxing stillness and thoughtfulness to it I really enjoyed, with theming on grief, time, and how relationships shape us and our experience of life. It was just very relaxing, but also fun. And then the characters are all pretty endearing as well, especially for me, Freerun, because I read her as autistic coded, and I know for a fact other people do too. So there. Also, she's absolutely not a morning person, and that's a big hashtag relate. Then I also watched, again with my partner Christopher, I mean these days I almost exclusively watch shows and movies with him rather than on my own, so we watched Avatar: The Way of Water, so the second Avatar movie, and for him it was a rewatch. I know it was really popular to hate on Avatar for a while, but I've always liked and defended the first Avatar movie. I've always loved its overtly interconnected ecological world building, I've always loved its pantheistic theming, and its unapologetic environmentalist theming. Sue me. But I guess that's part of the problem. My partner and I both fundamentally believe these movies are way too earnest for this cynicism and Marvel movie irony-infused age of ours. Yes, I'm deliberately throwing shade. Fuck it if it makes me a snob. But anyway, I really enjoyed the second Avatar movie too. I'm not sure I enjoyed it as much as the first one, or perhaps I enjoyed them about equally. It's just that this one felt more plot and action heavy than the first. Well, ideas-driven SFF reader here, I'm more interested in Pandoran ecology, anthropology, and spirituality. Not that this was absent from this movie by any means. I mean, you discover an entirely new Pandoran ecosystem in Way of Water. It's the fucking title. And, saving the whales. Yeah, that's literally at the heart of its freaking story. And so yes, I mean, I love that. I loved the alien whales. And so yes, I cried again. I cried watching the first movie. I cried watching this movie. Because that shit is beautiful to me, once again, sue me. So you can absolutely count on the fact I will go and see the third one in theaters this coming winter. And then in a completely different speculative register, my partner and I also decided to go to the movies when I was in Ireland last month, and I convinced him to go see 28 Years Later. Mostly because I kind of went through a zombie movie phase when I was a teenager. I mean, I also watched most of The Walking Dead with my parents, so there's that. And World War Z, that was when I was a young adult. Whatever. And so I wanted to honor my younger and past self, and also because, you know, I've seen the first two movies, and so I wanted to see what this long-awaited one would be like. I didn't think it would ever be made. When I learned that it was coming, I was like, oh wow, they actually made it. And it was very good. It was very good. My partner and I both thoroughly enjoyed it. It's also great because we had the movie, like the viewing room, you know what I mean? We had it all to ourselves. We were the only ones at that time at the movie theater watching 28 Years Later. It was great. So for me, the thing is that this movie had genuine personality, a genuine artistic signature, and again, a decent measure of earnestness, and I respect the crap out of that. I mean, I also just liked it because it appealed to things I like, but it was really its own thing. It had personality, it had oomph. Yes, I really liked the OST, the cinematography as well. Some things about it were a little weird to me, but overall I really liked just, yeah, the artistic signature of it, and the acting. Roth Fiennes in this movie, I had no idea. And, I mean, I kind of had to laugh at the semi-subtle nod to Brexit. And then, obviously, let's be real, the Zambo Schmidt. god damn. Again, if you know, you know. The ending did feel very abrupt, but then that's because this third movie in the series of 28 Days Later is apparently, itself, the first in a new trilogy. So I guess I'll have to stay tuned for the next one. Actually, it might be coming out later this year, so that means I may need to go to the movie theater twice again this year. Cool. And then I wanted to mention the fact I finally beat Cyberpunk 2077 on stream. Yes, I have a Twitch channel, if you're curious / interested, last weekend. And I got what is, to my mind, the best ending. Overall, I thought it was a very good game. The world and world building felt very immersive and unique. It had a solid story, good to very good character work, excellent vibe-fitting music. Oh, the Cyberpunk music is really good. And it was fun. It was plain old fun, which, you know, it's kind of essential for a video game. At least for me, even when it glitched. Yeah, I experienced a few glitches here and there. But you know what? It made me laugh my head off 90% of the time, because some of these glitches were so ridiculous, they were funny, so I'm not mad about it. And of course, most importantly, this was gloriously, unashamedly cyberpunk. Now, cyberpunk is not at all my favorite subgenre in science fiction. I mean, it's not the favorite, it's not even a favorite, but I can't help but admire the way the devs brought it to life here. Yeah, it was just incredible. And yes, as expected, bypass me, I found this game as a work of cyberpunk fiction infinitely more enjoyable than freaking Neuromancer. QED. So that will be all for my reading wrap-up for the second quarter, or the spring, kind of 2025, well, reading wrap-up and viewing and playing wrap-up again, sort of. I hope you found this video interesting, engaging, entertaining, that it helped you pass the time in a somewhat pleasant fashion. I warmly welcome anyone who wants to leave a comment to discuss any of the books or movies or shows I watched, read, played, you know what I mean. And on that very final note, I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves, and thank you for watching, and I shall see you all, I'm not really sure when, but I shall see you all in the next video, whenever that is. But until then, bye-bye.